Fundamental facts you should know about worry. Chapter 1. Live in day-tight compartment. In the spring of 1871, a young man picked up a book and read 21 words that had a profound effect on his fortune. A medical student at the Montreal General Hospital, he was worried about passing the final examination, worried about what to do, where to go, how to build up a practice, how to make a living. The 21 words that this young medical student read in 1871 helped him to become the most famous physician of his generation. He organized the world famous Johns Hopkins Schools of Medicine. He became Regius Profession of Medicine at Oxford, the highest honor that can be bestowed upon any medical man in the British Empire. He was knighted by the King of England. When he died, two huge volumes containing 1,466 pages were required to tell the story of his life. His name was Sir William Osier. Here are the 21 words that he read in the spring of 1871. 21 words from Thomas Sir Lale that help him lead a life free from worry. Our main business is not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand. What 2 years later, on a soft spring night, when the tulips were blooming on the campus, this man, Sir Williams Osier, addressed the students of Yale University. He told those Yale students that a man like himself, who had been a professor in your university and had written a popular book, was supposed to have brains of a practical equality. He declared that he was untrue. He said that his intimate friends knew that his brains were of the most mediocre character. When that was the secret of his success, he started that it was owing of what he called living in day-tight compartment. What did he mean by that? A few months before he spoke at Yale, Sir William Osier had crossed the Atlantic on a great oceans liner where the captain standing on the bridge could press a button and presto there was a clanging of machinery and various parts of the ship were immediately shut off from one another, shut off into watertight compartment. Now each one of you, Dr. Ozier said to those Yale students, is a much more marvelous organization than the great liner and bound on a longer voyage. What I urge is that you so learn to control the machinery as to live with the tight compartment as the most certain way to ensure safety on the voyage. Get on the bridge and see that at least the great bulkhead are in working order. Touch a button and here at every level of your life the iron doors shutting out the past, the dead yesterday. Touch another and shut off with a metal curtain the future and the unborn tomorrow. Then you are safe for today. Shut off the past, future, the unborn tomorrow. Shut off the past, let the dead past bury its dead. Shut out the yesterday which have light fools the way to dusty death. The load of tomorrow added to that of yesterday carried today makes the strongest falter. Shut off the future as tightly as the past. The future is today. There is no tomorrow. The day of the man's salvation is now. Waste of energy, mental distress, nervous worries dog the steps of a man who is anxious about the future. Shut close then the great fore and the aft bulkhead and prepare to cultivate the habit of life of day-tight compartment. Did Dr. Ozier mean to say that We should not make any effort to prepare for tomorrow. No, not at all. But he did go in that address to say that the best possible way to prepare for tomorrow is to concentrate with all your intelligence, all your enthusiasm on doing today work superbly today. This that is the only possible way you can prepare for the future. Sir William Osier urged the student at Yale to begin the day with Christ prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Remember that the prayer asks only for today bread. It doesn't complain about the stale bread we had to eat yesterday, and it doesn't say, "Oh God, it has been pretty dry out in the wheat belt lately, and we may have another drought, and then how will I get bread to eat next autumn? Or suppose I lose my job, oh God, how could I get bread then?" No, this is a prayer teach us to ask for today's bread only. Today's bread is the only kind of bread you can possibly eat. Years ago, a penniless philosopher was wandering through a stony country where the people had a hard times making a living. One day, a crowd gathered about him on a hill, and we gave what is probably the most quoted speech ever delivered anywhere at any time. This speech contained 26 words that have gone ringing down across the centuries. Take therefore no thought for the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient into the day is the evil therefore. Many men have rejected those words of Jesus, take no thought for the morrow. They have rejected those words as a counsel of perfection, as a bit of oriental mm, mightism. I must take thought for the morrow. They say I must take out insurance to protect my family. I must lay aside money for my old age. I must plan and prepare to get ahead. Right, of course you must. The truth is that those words of Jesus translate over 300 years ago don't mean today what they mean during the reign, reign of King James. 300 years ago, the word thought frequently mean anxiety. Modern versions of the Bible quote Jesus more accurately as saying, "Have no anxiety for the tomorrow." By all means, take thought for the tomorrow. Yes, careful thought and planning and preparation, but no anxiety. During the war, our military leaders planned for the morrow, but they could not afford to have any anxiety. I have supplied the best men with the best equipment. We have said Admiral Ernest J. King, who directed the United States Navy, and have given them what seems to be the wisest mission. That is all I can do. If a ship has been sunk, Admiral King went on, I can bring it up. If it is going to be sunk, I can stop it. I can use my time much better working on tomorrow problem than my fitting about yesterday. Besides, if I let those things get me, I wouldn't last long. Whether in war or peace, the chief difference between good thinking and bad thinking is this: good thinking deals with causes and effect and leads to logical constructive planning. Bad thinking frequently leads to tension and nervous breakdown. I recently had the privilege of interviewing author Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of one of the most famous newspaper in the world, the New York Times. Mr. Sulzberger told me that when the Second World War flamed across Europe, he was so stunned, so worried about the future that he found it almost impossible to sleep. He would frequently get out of bed in the middle of the night, take some canvas and tubes of paint, look in the mirror and try to paint a portrait of himself. He didn't know anything I recently had the privilege of interviewing author Selberg, published of one of the most famous newspaper in the world. The New York Times. Mr. Selberg told me that when the Second World War flamed across Europe, he was so stunned, so worried about the future that he found it almost impossible to sleep. He would frequently get out of bed in the middle of the night, take some canvas and tubes of paint, look in the mirror, and try to paint a portrait of himself. He didn't know anything about painting, but he painted anyway to get his mind off his worries. Mr. Sulzberg told me that he was never able to banish his worries and find peace until he had adopted as his motto 5 words from a church. One step enough for me. Lead kindly light. Keep to my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scenes. One step enough for me. At about the same time, a young man in uniform somewhere in Europe was learning the same lesson. His name was Tad Bergimino of 5716 New Holme Road, Baltimore, Maryland, and he had worried himself into a first class case of combat fatigue. In April 1945, writes Tad Bergimino, I had worried until I had developed what doctors call a spasmodic transverse colon condition that produces intense pain. If the war hadn't ended when it did, I am sure I would have had a complete physical breakdown. I was utterly exhausted. I was a grave registration non-commissioned officer for the 94th Infantry Division. My work was to help set up and maintain records of all men killed in action, missing in action, and hospitalized. I also had to help distinct disinter the bodies of both Allied and enemy soldiers who had been killed, hastily buried in shallow graves during the pitched battle. I had to gather up the personal effect of these men and see that they were sent back to parents or closest relatives who would prize them personal effects so much. I was constantly worried for fear we might be making embarrassing and serious mistake. I was worried about whether or not I would come through all this. I was worried about whether I would live to hold my only child in my arms, son of 16 months, whom I had never seen. I was so worried and exhausted that I lost 34 pounds. I was so frantic that I was almost out of my mind. I looked at my hands, they were hardly more than a skin and bones. I was terrified at the thought of the going home, a physical wreck. I broke down and sobbed like a child. It was so shaken that tears welled up every time I was alone. There was one period soon after the Battle of the bulk started that I wept so often that I almost gave up hope of ever being a normal human being again. I ended up in the army dispensary. An army doctor gave me some advice which has completely changed my life. After giving me a thorough physical examination, he informed me that my troubles were mental. Tad, he said, I want you to think of your life as an hourglass. You know there are thousands of grains of sand in the top of the hourglass, and they all pass slowly and eventually through the narrow neck in the middle. Nothing you or I could do would make more than one grain of sand pass through this narrow neck without impairing the hourglass. You and I, everyone else, are like this hourglass. When we start in the morning, there are hundreds of tasks which we feel that we must accomplish that day. But if we Do not take them one at a time. Let them pass through the day slowly and eventually, as do the grains of sand passing through the narrow neck of the hourglass. Then we are bound to break our own physical or mental structure. I have practiced that philosophy ever since that memorable day that an army doctor gave to it me. One grain of sand at a time, one task at a time. That advice saved me physically and mentally during the war, and it was also helped me in my present position in business. I am a stock control clerk for the commercial credit company in Baltimore. I found the same problem arising in business that had arising during the war. The score of things had to be done at once, and there was little time to do them. We were low in stock. We had new forms to handle, new stock arrangement, changes of address, opening and closing office, and so on. Instead of getting thought and nervous, I remember what the doctor had told me: one grain of sand at a time, one task at a time. By repeating those words to myself over and over, I accomplished my tasks in a more efficient manner, and I did my work without the confused and jumbled feeling that I had almost wrecked me on the battlefield. One of the most appalling One of the most appalling comment on our present way of life is that half of all of the beds in our hospital are reserved for patients with nervous and mental troubles, patients who have collapsed under the crushing burden of accumulated yesterday and fearful tomorrow. Yet a vast majority of those people would be walking the street today, leading happy, useful life if they had only heeded the word leading happy, useful life if they had only heeded the words of Jesus. Have no anxiety about the morrow. Or the words of Sir William's Osier, live in day tight compartment. You and I are standing this very second at the meeting place of two eternities, the vast past that has endured forever, and the future that is plunging on to the last syllable of recorded time. We can't possibly live in either of those eternities. No, not even for one split second, but by trying to do so, we can wreck both our bodies and our minds. So let's be content to live the only time we can possibly live from now until that time. Anyone can carry his burden, however hard, until nightfall. Wrote Robert Louis Stevenson. Anyone can do his work however hard for one day. Anyone can live sweetly, patiently, lovingly, purely till the sun goes down, and this is all that life really means. Yes, this is all that life records of us. But Miss E.K. Shield, 815 Court Street, Saginaw, Michigan, was driving to despair, even to the brink of suicide, before she learned to live just till bedtime. In 1937, I lost my husband. Miss Shields said as she told me her story. I was depressed and almost penniless. I wrote my former employer, Mr. Leon Roach of the Roach Fowler Company of Kansas City, and got my old job back. I had formerly made my living selling books to ruler and town school boards. I had sold my car 2 years previously when my husband became ill, but I managed to scrap together enough money to put a down payment on a used car. Started out to sell book again. I had thought that getting back on the road would help relieve my depression, but driving alone and eating alone was almost more than I could take. Some of the territory was not very productive, and I found it hard to make those car payments, small as they were. In the spring of 1938, I was working out from Versailles, Missouri. The schools were poor, the roads bad. I was so lonely and discouraged that at one time I even considered suicide. It seems that success was impossible. I had nothing to live for. I dread I dreaded getting up each morning and facing life. I was afraid of everything, afraid I could not meet the car payment, afraid I could not pay for my room rent, afraid I would not have enough to eat. I was afraid my health was failing, falling, and I had no money for a doctor. All that kept me from suicide were the thoughts that my sister would be deeply grieved and that I did not have enough money to pay my funeral expenses. Then one day I read an article that lifted me out of my despondence and gave me the courage to go on living. I shall never cease to be grateful for one string sentence in that article. It said, "Every day is a new life to a wise man." I typed that sentence out and pasted it on the windshield of my car, where I saw it every minute I was driving. I found it wasn't so hard to live only one day at a time. I learned to forget the yesterdays and where I saw it every minute I was driving, I found it wasn't so hard to live only one day at a time. I learned to forget the yesterday and to not think of the tomorrow. Each morning I said to myself, today is a new life. I have succeeded in overcoming my fear of loneliness by fear of want. I am happy and fairly successful now and have a lot of enthusiasm and love for life. Know now that I shall never again be afraid regardless of what life hands me. I know now that I don't have to fear the future. I know now that I can live one day at a time and that every day is a new life to a wise man.